Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Military History Podcast. As always, I am Andy, your host, and today we have an incredible guest who is joining us all the way from Switzerland, Jean-Loup Gassend, and he is a searcher slash digger slash battlefield searcher archaeologist. He's a forensic pathologist. He's an incredible individual who does things that I could not wait to talk about on the podcast. Sir, thank you for coming on. How are you doing today?
You're welcome. I'm fine, a bit tired actually, but last night my chief invited me to her house and we had a bit too much wine. But other than that, I'm fine.
You know, honesty time on the podcast. I had my friend over last night and we had a little bit of wine too. And so this is evening your time. You're joining us from Switzerland. It's morning my time. So again, I appreciate you coming on. What I usually do with my interviews is I just kind of start from the beginning. And, usually when I interview veterans, I start from the beginning of their lives and kind of work through. You got into military history very early, so I'm going to do something very similar in terms of how we go about beginning the interview here, sir.
Yeah.
Where were you born?
So I was born in Ottawa, Canada.
Mhm.
And my dad is French and my mother is Canadian. And when I was about 10 years old, then we moved to Nice in southern France, the area of Nice.
Okay, understood. I got to kind of ask, how was that transition being 10 years old and moving all the way from Canada to Nice? And what prompted that move?
My father was always working abroad. Like that's the reason he wasn't in Canada in the first place. And he usually changed jobs every few years, and at the same time as he changed jobs, he changed countries. So we just followed along. Actually, I didn't mention it, but between Canada and France, we also lived in Madagascar and Ivory Coast for a while. So it was, yeah, we moved quite a few times.
Oh, okay. This is all right. This is really interesting to me. I was born in the same city I live in, and
Okay.
I've been lucky to have traveled a bit on my own time. But this sounds like an action-packed, adventurous childhood. And now, so you're 10 years old. You've moved to the south of France. There was quite a bit of, I mean, my interest in military history really began in World War II, and I've gotten more interested in military history in general. So my interests have like kind of, as long as there have been people, they've been trying to find ways to kill each other, it seems. So
Yep.
my interests have just kind of grown exponentially. But it seems that you moved to a place that was very steeped in military history. Second World War, the landings in the south of France occurred in August of 1944. Uh, when did you start to get interested in military history?
Well, just before moving to France, I found a book about the Battle of Britain in my house, which was very fascinating, I thought.
Mm.
And then I started making model airplanes of Spitfires and Messerschmitts and that kind of thing. And we moved to France, and you are correct to say that southern France is steeped in military history, but it really isn't obvious if you don't know about it, because it's also the French Riviera with lots of tourists, lots of hotels, and it's not really the kind of place where World War II history is what you hear about when you actually live there. So I lived there for several years, not really knowing anything about the local World War II history, and they have the little Maginot line, between Italy and France up in the mountains. And once we went to visit one of those forts with my dad and with some friends, and then I saw these empty bullet casings on the ground that were from World War II, and that was the first time I'd ever found something from World War II still on the ground. And of course, we picked a bunch of them up and stuff. And then slowly but surely, I just got more and more interested in World War II history. It passed from the Battle of Britain to more infantry history, let's say army history. And at first, I wasn't really interested in the southern France stuff because you always see movies about Normandy, about other areas.
Yes.
And I was kind of disappointed, to find, oh, this is like a German helmet, but it's from southern France, not from Normandy, so it's not too exciting. And then when you actually start knowing the local history, then it completely changes.
Yes.
Now I don't care about Normandy at all. I mean, I don't go there. I don't live there. I haven't interviewed veterans from there. And the exact opposite happened in Nice. I started speaking to old people who told me, this happened here and that happened there.
Wow.
And then I wrote a book about this and interviewed a whole bunch of American veterans, Canadian veterans, local resistance guys, local civilians. And so now southern France is the place that fascinates me completely more than anywhere
Wow.
else.
I have to agree with you. I my interest in the invasion of southern France, it really began with a personal interest in the 509th Parachute Infantry,
Okay.
and I found obscure references to airborne operations in the Mediterranean, and it just seemed like the attention span of the collective Second World War, following of, not only just amateur folks, but also it seemed like academics was focused on Normandy. And I think that has to do a lot with narratives that were created during the war and that perpetuated on. But I just got interested. And then all of a sudden, there was this whole other D-Day that happened in the south of France. And it was incredible. It's incredible history to study. The fact that you lived there, you were boots on the ground and developing an interest simultaneously, to me, it sounds like paradise. What was that like
Well,
for you?
it kind of was, I'd say from the period between about 2000 and 2010. You could literally, I mean, I was a student, so I had lots of free time, and you could literally go to any village and speak to an old guy on the bench, and he would tell you about what happened, the day his town was liberated by the Allied troops.
Wow.
And you could look up these units like the 509th that you mentioned, or the 517th, and they still had 10, 20, 30 guys alive from each company. So you could call them up and say, do you remember the day that this happened and that happened? And of course, most wouldn't remember, but then you'd always find a couple of guys who would remember really well. And so yeah, it was a very interesting time period, and yeah, kind of paradise. Especially southern France is a bit of a paradise on its own. I mean,
Yes.
sunny weather, very nice countryside, and yeah, so it was paradise in one way. Yes.
If I found at a local militaria show, I used to be really into collecting militaria. It was really a big part of how I approached my passion with military history. I've been finding other ways personally to interact with military history that in a way fulfills me a little bit more. And especially since I moved into my own apartment, money's going elsewhere. Who knows, maybe when I get a full-time, when I get settled into a career and settled into a home, collecting might come back. But without going too far into that, I found a little grouping of somebody who had gone to the south of France, and
Yeah.
there was a pamphlet called if I remember correctly. Now, this is my French coming through, so watch out. Côte d'Azur, is
Yeah.
that correct? It's the
Côte
blue
d'Azur. Yeah.
coast. Okay, thank you. How do you pronounce it?
Côte d'Azur.
Côte d'Azur. Okay,
Yeah. Côte d'Azur.
we're getting there. Thank you. It seems like a beautiful place. I would love to go there. So coming back to your childhood, coming back to you as moving into being a teenager, I have to touch on this story because this is incredible. I still have the collecting bug. So you found something pretty cool hanging on the wall of a restaurant. And I'm talking about the helmet. And I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
wondering if you could share that story because I think it's pretty cool and it shows how you were starting to interact with military history, even when you were young.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I have to say is that I found that helmet, I think, when I was 16, if I'm not mistaken. And at the time, I hadn't read any books about the invasion of southern France. I really knew next to nothing about it. But luckily, just a few months before I found that helmet, I'd gone to a local collector's house, a guy who, goes through garbage dumps and old houses and stuff like that. And he had quite a bit of this American Southern France paratrooper stuff, and he was showing me, see, they have this typical camouflage paint and this and that. So when I went in, so when I found this helmet, the story is that there's something called the Hash House Harriers. It's a running club that exists all over the world, run by British people. And every Saturday or every Sunday, they organize a run in some completely obscure village, and they make a trail with flour on the ground and stuff like that. Anyway, I went to that with my family, and my dad had injured his foot cutting the palm tree. He had a spike from the palm tree going to his foot, so he couldn't run. And I was on the run, and for some reason, I just felt like, there's something from the war here. I don't know why. So I was looking, in the bushes between the trees. I just felt there was going to be something there. And after the run, we got back to the village, and my dad had waited in the village the whole time. And I said, "Did you see something from the war?" And he said, "Oh yeah, there's a helmet hanging on the wall in the restaurant." So I went in the restaurant, and I saw this helmet with this camouflage paint and this mark of the net on it and stuff. And if I had seen it just a few months before, I would have thought, this doesn't look like it's from World War II. It looks like something from the Vietnam War or something, because World War II helmets didn't have this kind of camouflage. Luckily, I'd been to this collector's house and understood that these things were basically the holy grails. So I understood what I was looking at. And I asked the restaurant owner if he wanted to sell it. I told him I collected these things and whatever. And he wasn't a very friendly guy, and he wasn't selling it basically. So I left without the helmet. And then, I went back there maybe a month later with other World War II helmets and proposed to exchange it. I called his wife once and said, "Please, can you convince him to sell this helmet and whatever?"
You
Like I said,
called
I
his
was
wife. I love that.
yeah,
You
yeah.
get the woman involved, and then things start to happen.
Yeah. So I was 16. I was really desperate, and one day he said no, like I'm keeping it. And then one day he came to my house, rang the doorbell, and he didn't have anything in his hands as far as I saw. And then he pulled the helmet out from behind his back, and he said, "Okay, I'll sell it to you, whatever."
Oh,
So at the time, I bought it for 500 French francs, which was a lot of money. That's what I got for my birthday once per year.
mhm.
But now it's completely ridiculous when you think about it. It's like $60 or $70 basically.
Yeah. I'll just say you did
And,
well. You did well on that investment. Those helmets are, I don't know what it is about helmets, but helmets seem to draw a lot of collectors' eyes, and there's something about them. And it's something I've thought about for a while, but again, we're talking about other things today. They seem to bring a lot of attention, and they seem to bring a lot of money. So I think you did well with that investment. And
yeah,
yeah, there's I saw a video that you put on YouTube, and if people want to follow you, I'm going to link your YouTube as well in the description here, because you post really cool stuff, and that's how I found you.
thanks. Just I'll interrupt you for a second, because this was just the first part of the
Oh,
story.
sure.
Helmet,
Please continue.
because then the point is that so I told people what this helmet looked like, but I didn't say what it is. It's actually a helmet from the 517th Parachute Infantry, which is one of the units that jumped into southern France on August 15th. And on the helmet, there's a carving in French. It says "Souvenir of August 24th, 1944." And that turned out being the day that that village, it's called Courm, had been liberated by the 517th, by the 3rd Battalion to be more precise, or the 3rd Battalion was the first to get there. And then on the helmet, it also has a name written, which was Moles. And so the lucky thing, the 517th is a popular unit, so they have a website with lots of pictures, lots of documents scanned. And on the website, I went through their whole list, and I found that there was only one guy called Moles. His name was Marvin Moles, and he was in the 3rd Battalion of the 517th, so it would make sense that he had gone through that village of Courm. And then I looked him up in the white pages, and since his name was pretty uncommon, Marvin Moles, well, I found him and I called him, and he was a bit surprised at first. He said, like, my helmet got blued off my head in the bulge and stuff like that. And then I told him, I'm in southern France. This was before the bulge, so maybe it's another helmet. And then he understood that, the American soldiers were very wasteful with their equipment. I mean, they usually threw lots of stuff away. All the French civilians always say, when the Americans went through, then we found helmets, guns, grenades,
Yes.
everything just lying around. So it was August. There wasn't much fighting, and apparently lots of paratroopers threw away their helmets pretty quickly. So anyway, I invited Marvin Moles to come back to France. That was in 2004, and so he came to France and he saw his helmet, and then we visited the village, and yeah, so it was a pretty unique experience. To researching items is always interesting, and having a named item that you find on the battlefield and still having the veteran alive is something that has now become pretty much impossible, but it was always
Yeah.
rare, I think. And he had a good memory. He told me everything. I recorded everything. I included all his story in my book.
Yeah.
And so it was really the perfect story, like perfect helmet, perfect condition, perfectly documented, and with the veterans' pictures, the veterans' story, with everything. It's so yeah, my most
Well,
prized possession.
I well, first of all, I want to say this. Uh, yes, yes, the helmet is cool. The 517, they used this specific kind of helmet net, the shrimp net, as it's called in colloquial collector nerdology, the shrimp net. And then they had engineers come out to the airfield before they boarded the airplanes, and they literally just sprayed these guys with kind of camouflage paint. So these helmets had paint just sprayed over the helmet. And they had specific chin straps on these
Exactly.
helmets. They modified them because there weren't enough paratroop specific helmets. See, the nerdology is deep here with me, and I think also with you, in
Yes,
terms of understanding, that this helmet itself is really cool. But I think it's cooler that you met the veteran and that you
of
did the
course.
work to get him out, record his story. I've gotten a couple World War II vets on my podcast. I'm very proud of that. And we are reaching an inflection point right now in terms of it's just very, very difficult to get people from that age now to be able to come on the show, my show, any show, and unfortunately remember what in enough detail that can help us understand the events. So the work you did there, I think now, and then again, we're touching on something that I'm really passionate about. And this is the ability for artifacts to transcend the temporal divide between the current and the past, the present and the past, and get people through interacting with physical objects to be able to perhaps connect with the past more deeply than if they were just, say, reading a book. And the fact that you're a writer, you interview veterans, you're also a collector. It's something I strive to do all of these things. I think you're doing a great job. And what you did with Mr. Moles is incredible. Hopefully soon we'll be featuring this particular helmet on the virtual museum I'm going to be launching on my website. So people can keep an eye out for that. There's also a video you did of it on your YouTube channel. So I just wanted to commend you for doing that because yes, the item is cool. Yes, a lot of people are really into collecting World War II paratrooper helmets. It's its own sometimes horrific subgenre of military history. But I want to keep moving here because your relationship with military history continued after you were 16, 17, mobbing around the south of France, finding incredible objects just hanging on the walls, which is just mind blowing to me.
That didn't happen every day, just to be specific.
Absolutely, absolutely. See, in my mind, it's like a candy land, and you're walking around just scooping stuff up. But when you're 18, if I got this correct, when you're 18, you took a trip to Russia to do what exactly, and how did that happen?
Well, I heard about people looking for digging stuff up in southern France. Since I was 17, I didn't have a metal detector yet, and I didn't have a car, I didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't go to the places where you could actually look for stuff. And then I heard that in Russia, they're still finding bodies of German soldiers, bodies of Russian soldiers, and I mean, not one or two. I mean, you go there for 2 weeks and they find 150 bodies, for example. And that to me sounded completely fascinating. So I got in touch with a German organization that's called the VBGO, VBGO, And I guess I must have, without realizing it, I must have harassed them into letting me come and join them. So when I was 18, we went to Stalingrad, to the battlefield there, and we looked for bodies of it was supposed to be German soldiers, but the problem is that German bodies are always buried with a helmet, with a belt. Well, not always, but you find them with belt buckles, helmets, identification tags, and all that stuff is worth, a certain amount of money. So in Russia, they had basically local diggers didn't want people coming from Germany and finding these German bodies and then preventing them from taking the stuff and selling it. So there's a bit of competition, let's say. But we did. They brought us to places they had already dug up in the past, and we found the bones all mixed together and a few ID tags in the middle, and we picked them all up. And in the end, on paper, we had found 115 bodies, but actually only a few of those bodies had been untouched. Most were just a jumble of bones that we picked out of former mass graves, basically.
Now, this is so fascinating to me. A million things I've prepared questions. I've prepared for this, but I really want to first touch on the fact that this is an interesting thing for an 18-year-old to be doing on his summer holiday. And I just also want to touch on the fact that you are now, if I know that, if this is correct, you're a forensic pathologist by career. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So morbidity, it seems, has taken a hold with you. How did that happen? And did it start when you were 18 years old in Russia, digging up skeletons as your holiday?
I'm really not sure how it started. I remember when I was a kid, when I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, there was a huge train crash in Alberta, I think. And I was completely fascinated by that train crash, and I was like, taking my Brio train and simulating the crash and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was always interested when, on TV they were speaking about some war zone or some death or some murder and stuff like that. And I didn't really think about what I wanted to do as an adult, and I wasn't a good student and stuff, and I didn't think I could do medicine. And then when I was about 15, 16, one day I thought, maybe I could try doing medicine, and what seemed interesting to me was forensic medicine. The other things that seemed interesting were maybe, working in as a crime scene technician, or maybe being in the army, whatever. And I tried doing the highest thing, the best paid, and the one where you can actually travel more and stuff like that. And that was, so I ended up being a forensic pathologist, which is what I am now. But when I went to Russia that first time, for example, I hadn't even started studying medicine yet. Before going into medicine, I went to engineering school for 1 year. And so it had nothing to do with medicine.
Yeah.
But it's more like I went into medicine because I was interested in these dead World War II bodies. But my main interest is the World War II. It's not medicine, let's say.
Understood. Now, I'm going to ask, for the benefit of those listening, would you please define the role of a forensic pathologist and what you do day to day?
Yeah,
in your job.
A forensic pathologist is basically a doctor who he doesn't work for the police or for the prosecutor, but he works when the police have a question or the prosecutor has a question to help them in their investigations. They need a forensic pathologist, and basically what that means in practice is that when somebody gets murdered, when somebody commits suicide, when a body is found in the forest, when there's a car accident, when there's a violent death, then the forensic pathologist does an autopsy, and his job is to say what the cause of death is, to maybe say this death looks natural, but it's actually suspicious, or the other way around. This girl who had a fight with her boyfriend, well, actually, we found that she has a natural cause of death, so no, her boyfriend didn't kill her. And we also see victims of rape, victims, people who were shot but survived, or had fights in the street but survived. So whenever a prosecutor needs to know what exactly happened to this body, or what exactly happened to this victim, he has to have a forensic pathologist give him the medical information, the relevant medical information. For example, if somebody's got stabbed and is at the hospital, we go and we see, like, was this stabbing serious or not? Did he almost die, or was it just something completely, a scratch, and then we give that information to the prosecutor so he can decide what to do with the attacker or the guilty person.
Wow. Well, I know we have limited time today, but a million questions have come up already about that. Interesting and fascinating. But what's really good, see, I'm building my own case here as to why you are highly credentialed to be the one going over because and finding people on the Eastern Front. So you started when you were 18, but this is something you continued right up to the pandemic. Is that correct?
I didn't go every year. So I went when I was 18. That was 2001. And then I went in 2005 to Russia, but not to find bodies. I just contacted a guy who was looking for helmets and things like that. And I can go into details. Basically, people were saying like you're selling. He had an internet site where he was constantly selling all these helmets in great condition dug up from swampy areas, and people were saying, this is stolen from graves and stuff on these forums. So he said, look, if you think I'm stealing from graves, just come and see what we do. Join us for free. And lots of people said, oh yeah, I'm going to come. And I said, I can't come because I have no money and stuff. But in the end, I had a bit of money to pay the airplane ticket. And so in the end, I was the only one who actually went there. Yeah. And I saw what they were doing. It was really interesting. These guys were, what they were doing was, I don't know if it was illegal because it's in Russia, but it wasn't official, let's say.
Yeah.
And but they were professionals. They knew exactly where to look. They knew exactly how to dig. It was really impressive to see them. They know how to find things better than probably any professional archaeologist or anything, because they actually do that as a living year after year,
That's incredible.
Yeah. And then I didn't go to Russia again until I think it was 2014. A friend of mine just found an article and he said, oh yeah, wouldn't it be cool to go back to Russia like you did before? And then I thought, yeah, actually it would be. So I got in contact with the group and went into this swampy area, Myasnoy Bor. And then the year after, I went to Volgograd and got into contact with the people there. So Volgograd is Stalingrad. And since then, so 2014 to 2019, I went every summer. Yeah. And then the Corona started, and they cut out. They didn't give us visas anymore. Yeah. So 20 and 21, I didn't do anything.
Copy that.
Any of that.
The war in the East was something that I did not come into contact with very much as I studied about the Second World War. And a big part of that was that I was really interested in things like the invasion of the south of France. I was interested in things where my countrymen had been. When I first traveled to Europe, most of my time was spent in Western Europe. I briefly went to Poland to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau, but that was like the only time in kind of the East, if you could even call Poland that, that I spent. But after I came into contact with the reality that I didn't know as much as maybe I should, as somebody who wants to become a military historian, about the Eastern Front, I began to read and I began to learn, and the Eastern Front was one of the most brutal, apocalyptic occurrences I think our collective civilization has ever seen. It was its own just meat grinder in ways that was driven by two totalitarian regimes just throwing themselves at each other. You have what I would argue is a unique and well-informed perspective on the reality of what that was. I've watched some of your videos, and I reached out to you because recently you put a video up where you were working to dig fallen soldiers. I think it was both German and Russian folks that you were finding this time around in the video you posted. But what really fascinates me is that as you are finding these guys, you're looking for identification, you're trying your best to identify these folks. Sometimes the bodies are intermingled. I'm going to let you get into that. But you're also noticing and documenting for the camera, this guy had his legs amputated. I'm going to hold up the femur and show the saw cut. If anybody wants to kind of shed simplistic narratives, idealized misconceptions about war is like, I highly recommend at least watching some of your videos, listening to this interview, and if they can scrape up their money, maybe go volunteer like you do. But you also have mentioned something that for a long time I've wanted to talk about, and I'm glad you're here and we'll get into this, which is kind of this interesting ecosystem of people in Russia who dig stuff up for profit. And I've seen videos of guys digging stuff up and they get a helmet that's in nice shape, but there's a skull in it. And they take the helmet and they just kind of chuck the skull. I've seen that. And I've had kind of questions about the morality of that, perhaps, but then also the understanding of the economic situation that would drive people to do that. So it's nuanced. So I'd love to get into that. But first, just kind of preempting you for that conversation, which will come,
Yeah.
I want to ask you about, you're at a dig site, and I really want to kind of see if you can take us with you through the process of going to a dig site and finding their people there and then beginning to exhume them. Can you walk us through that, almost like you're taking us with you? You're taking me in the audience with you on that.
Yeah.
That
Well, the
whole
way
process.
it depends, like what country you're in, what the information you have is. But when I go to Russia, we have no specific information. What happens is that I join a group of Russians over there, and they have permissions to dig in such and such an area for this summer, let's say. And then we just go over the battlefield with metal detectors and with these probes that they use to feel if there's anything buried underground. And we just basically search randomly. They also have German reconnaissance pictures taken during the war that they match up with current GPS. So you can be in a field where there's nothing, and then they can say, okay, all the trenches were in this area, so let's search more over here,
Wow.
And that's the way it generally happens. But then sometimes you have more specific information. Like one of these videos, there's a scene where you see, I think, 7 or 8 bodies all intermingled. That's in a village called the Vertiachi, which was near Stalingrad. And in that area, we had very specific information. The information was that within the German pocket of surrounded soldiers, they had a little Russian POW camp, and basically everybody in that camp died, because even the Germans started dying of hunger by the end. So all these guys died. And then what happened in Russia was that they just buried the bodies in the nearest hole. So when we were there, we went to this forest and we could still slightly see the outlines of trenches and foxholes. And literally every hole we dug in had at least one body inside it, So that was a different kind of situation, And then you can also have situations, which was this German with amputated legs, where from the German archives that there's supposed to be a field cemetery in this village. And then you find a witness who tells you where it is. And then okay, there's supposed to be 25 guys buried here, so I found one. And so it means the others must be right beside him. And then you look for them like that. But that's the exception. That's what the German War Graves Commission does. The usual searching in Russia is just combing the battlefield with metal detectors and looking at the old aerial pictures and hoping to find bodies. And finding bodies is the exception, of course. You usually find the most, of course, is ammunition, because when people find it, they just leave it there. So you find shells, you might find a few helmets, you find junk, pieces of who knows what metal. Yeah. And then one day you're lucky and you dig, you see a helmet, then you move the helmet and you see there's a skull inside. And then you try to look what direction the soldier's lying in, enlarge the hole to try to find the whole body. And then quite often in Russia, there's not just one, there's usually several that are together.
How many bodies would you say you've personally participated in either, digging up and moving to a proper cemetery, or perhaps it's repatriation back to either Germany.
They're
How
never
many bought?
repatriated.
Okay, I see.
They're always buried on local cemeteries.
I see.
Maybe 200 or something like that.
Wow.
It depends. This year when we were digging in the prison camp, for example, like you saw, right? You dig one hole and there's 8 bodies in a single hole. Then you dig another hole right beside and there's 5 bodies.
Yeah.
And then another one there's 2 bodies. So just that, I think me and my friend we found 25 bodies in 3 or 4 days or something like that.
Oh my God.
But then last time I went, we were looking for 2 weeks, and I only found one location where there were 3 bodies buried.
It's
So all
something. Oh, sorry.
the
Go
rest of the
ahead.
time you're just searching and you find shells and things like that.
Mhm.
What you have to understand from these videos is that it's a concentrated,
Yes. Yes.
as
You're-
usual.
You're editing them together.
Yeah, I mean, the last video you saw is the best parts of 5 or 6 old videos
Yeah.
that are themselves the best parts of 2 weeks of digging. So what you see is only the most interesting moments of actually a 3 or 4 month period.
Walk us through. We'll do something similar here with this next question. We'll put together a greatest hits of finding bodies. And I want to ask you, as you look back on your career doing this, your informal career, what are some things that immediately stick out in terms of findings that will stay with you and have stayed with you?
Well, the main thing is that in my open quotation marks village, because it's not my village where I'm born, but the village I grew up in southern France, I found a mass grave of 14 Germans in that village. And that was a place that I knew perfectly well because I lived there. And it was on this French Riviera. And I spoke to people who knew the bodies were there. I spoke to people whose fathers had buried the bodies. I spoke to the Americans and Canadians who had been in combat with these soldiers. And I found the families of the soldiers. And so it was really like I knew the area, I found the bodies, I found the families, I found the people who shot them and killed them, whatever. And so it was really a whole thing together that made it, let's say, incredible. Whereas in Russia, I mentioned finding 25 bodies, but not a single one of them was identified. So of course it's very interesting. Of course it's a bit emotional and stuff finding bodies, but then it didn't go anywhere. You didn't find the children, you didn't find the grandchildren. So of course the southern France case remains the most outstanding one. And then the other thing that I would say is quite outstanding is when somebody from the German War Graves Commission told me, you're a forensic pathologist. If you want, you can come and see how we look for these German bodies in Croatia. And this was these cases where it was field cemeteries. And so this is the places where we found bodies that had legs amputated, that had surgical drains in their wounds, that had chest drains, things like that. And that was, one body was cut in half, one body was blown to pieces. And it was extremely interesting. And it's also quite shocking to say, like, look, this guy, he has both his legs cut off by a surgeon. Yeah. Then they just dumped him in this hole, and now 80 years went by and nobody ever came to look for him. Yeah. So that was also something that sticks out a lot, more than just these random bodies on the battlefield where you might not, I mean, when you see that a doctor and people actually tried to save the guy and didn't manage it, it adds another touch of horror to it, let's say.
Yeah, well, the archaeology is revealing the past. It's revealing those events, and they've been hidden by time and a couple feet of dirt. And you're coming along and sharing those stories. What are some misconceptions about war? And you can get as specific as this as possible. War on the Eastern Front, war in the south of France, war in general. What are some misconceptions that maybe you had before you started doing this, or you've seen people perhaps in the golden cathedral of internet chat forums where everybody seems to know everything about anything? And even if they don't, what are some misconceptions that either you personally or that you see people have you put to bed? Have you disproved through actually exhuming these bodies and seeing the horrors of what happened to these guys?
I'd say one of the first things that happened is when I started finding Germans, is realizing like these aren't, just a bunch of crazy bloodthirsty Nazis. This guy is a 17-year-old guy from some village in Poland who has a Polish name and who maybe didn't speak German. And you contact the families and you see this is the guy with his 3 children, and you start realizing, well, yeah, this whole vision that people have of German World War II soldiers, they say Nazi this and Nazi that. Yeah, well, there were people like that, but it was also basically just an enlisted army where people got drafted whether they liked it or not.
Oh yeah.
They had horrible casualties. They had a horrible experience, and they were also people suffering a lot,
Yeah.
and their families suffered a lot. So that it changed my vision of German soldiers being, these robots who just spent their time killing people and whatever. And when I was speaking to civilians in southern France, they actually usually spoke more negatively of the French resistance than they did of the Germans, because
Really?
the Germans were usually in southern France. It wasn't a very violent area. They were usually quite respectful. They did execute quite a few resistance people, but they actually were members of the resistance. They weren't just random civilians. And they weren't allowed to steal things. They weren't allowed to rape. I mean, they were under tight discipline. Whereas the resistance, they always had to steal food. Some people, I mean, they weren't under any kind of discipline, so they did quite a lot of things that were not resistance actions, but simple crimes or revenge or personal stories. So yeah, people had usually quite reserved opinions about the resistance.
Fascinating.
And you're mentioning, so what about the other thing I'd say, misconceptions, people, well, people, I mean, I guess once you're an adult, you realize that, or if you study the problem, you'll realize that's not true. But as a child or as a teenager, you think that war is just, attacking every day and action all the time and stuff. And then when you're in these battlefields, you see these trenches, and you know that the guys were sitting there for 3 months without doing anything.
Yeah.
You can see by things you find that they were bored out of their minds. They're building things with their hands, making trench art.
Condoms in a
Condoms.
surprising amount of pockets. Talk about
Yeah,
humanizing these people.
yeah.
I
Well,
noticed that in your videos. It's like, oh, here's another condom.
yeah, finding condoms is pretty, well, obviously it's pretty funny. First of all, people don't realize condoms existed back then. Secondly, they wonder, why would the soldiers need condoms?
Yeah.
But soldiers, of course, they're going to have sex with local girls. They're going to have sex with prostitutes, and if they get an STD, then they're going to be taken out of the front lines for a bit. So they're going to be happy to get it. So I'm not sure what the German army regulations were, but I was recently reading the British regulations for Operation Dragoon, and they said, every soldier has to have 3 condoms, and people with STDs will not be taken out of the lines. They'll have to stay with their unit. So it's just a way of protecting the soldiers from falling sick.
Sure.
And removing their excuse as well for maybe being sick and away from the front lines.
Yeah. Talk about humanizing these people. I mentioned to you my fascination with the 509th Parachute Infantry. And when they were still called the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd, when they were the first American parachute battalion to go overseas. When they're in England, apparently these guys are having quite a few escapades of their own. And their doctor, their surgeon, recorded that there was quite a few STDs going around. There were quite a few children being born, and directives had to come down from, the colonel who was in charge to help tighten up some of these escapades, some of these fraternizations, we should say. And then apparently also when these guys took off to take their 1,500-mile journey, the longest airborne drop flight from the Second World War. And there was a reason it didn't happen again. It was disastrous. The planes broke up their formation. But anyways, again, the nerdology is deep with me. The women lined up. There were a lot of women who came to the airfield to say goodbye to these guys. There were a lot of broken hearts and some marriages. But anyways, soldiers are soldiers. And it seems that what you are disproving, the misconceptions, we should say, I would say, I want to just share my phrasing of what I think you're saying. I think the simplistic narratives that people have concerning war fall apart the more deeply you learn about it. And then you start to understand the nuance of the past. And that's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to look at the millions of people who died in the Second World War and not see a statistic, but see that number representing individuals. So it's easy for people, myself included, I am subject to this, and I do my best through Parse watching your videos and things like that to try to disprove this, that these were people. They had condoms in their pockets. Doctors tried to save them. There's an incredible book written by Christopher Browning, who's an American professor at the University of Washington in Washington State, called Ordinary Men. And this book is I featured it on my podcast years ago when I was just starting my podcast, and it was mainly book reviews. This followed the Reserve Police Battalion 101 as they moved through Poland and were the first foot soldiers in Hitler's Holocaust, his final solution. And this book documents some of the things they did. But more importantly, this historian, Christopher Browning, through an incredible amount of primary sources, documented indisputably how these actions were affecting these people. And if you read this book, you begin to understand the true horror of things like the Holocaust, the true horror of the Eastern Front. It wasn't just robots committing atrocities. It was people, and in many cases, people just like you and me who were forced to do horrible things. Like the German army was, especially getting in later into the war, conscript force, people who weren't even German forming units because they were so desperate for people. When you start to believe that, you start to understand the nuance of war, and it gets really uncomfortable. But I think war is uncomfortable.
You know, I've spoken to a lot of veterans. I've been interviewed them, and also spoken to a lot of French civilians. And it's very rare that one of them really had hatred towards the Germans. You know, they didn't like them, of course, but nobody was hating them. And sometimes on the YouTube videos I have, you have people that comment that are obviously born way after the war, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, like dig up these Germans so you can, burn their bones, or why are you digging them? They don't deserve anything." These people who didn't actually live through it are much more hateful than actual victims of that time. You know, which is it shows the kind of post-war propaganda or narrative or exaggerations that occurred, and how history is oriented in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, simplistic narratives predominate how a lot of people think about the past, and especially the Second World War. There's something about the Second World War. And then I also wanted to touch on the fact that there weren't photographers at a field hospital. The German Goebbels did not dispatch propagandists to go create high quality photography of people getting their legs amputated and then getting thrown in a hole. That documentation is scarce, and it's scarce for a reason. If people at the time understand how horrible the war is, are they going to buy war bonds? If they think about the enemy as people, are they gonna enlist to go kill them? These simplistic narratives drive events that happened at the time, and then as more time passes and they're not challenged and they're not looked at deeply, they fester and they grow, and then they become kind of an encompassing narrative. So I think what you do is just, it does a lot to help people understand the reality. And I want to ask, go ahead.
When you show the people an individual example, you say, like, look, this is this guy, this is his picture. This is him when we dug him up, and see this is the hole in his skull from the shell fragment.
Yeah.
And this is the letter that his family received. This is the letter his sister sent to the Red Cross 20 years later asking where his body was. Then people realize all of a sudden, oh, like, well, instead of just being a statistic, like you said, all of a sudden becomes an actual person, an actual face. Yeah. And of course you can't then, I mean, you can't see it in the same way anymore.
What was the main cause of death that you see from people?
Well, usually it's shrapnel wounds. I mean, fragment wounds, and I mean, that's what I see on the battlefield. But all you have to do is look at a statistic done by done the time. It's usually 80 or 70 or 90% killed by fragments,
Yeah,
by shell fragments. Then, of course, it depends. If it was some anti-partisan situation, then it was more gunshot wounds because it was more close fighting and
sure.
ambushes and things like that.
It's fascinating to watch in one of your videos. You have the skull next to the helmet, and there's a little pea-sized hole in the helmet. There's a little pea-sized hole in the front of the skull, and then you say, as the earth falls out of the helmet, look at this little pea-sized piece of metal. That's what killed this guy.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's fascinating. A lot of people see in the movies because the movies seem to predominate how at least people in my country interact with military history, which is something I'd like to see changed. But at least in the movies, it's mostly people shooting each other. And what, again, there's a lot of frontline trenches. There's a lot of time spent in single areas. Shell fire killed the most people. And it's fascinating to see that come through in your videos because you're a forensic pathologist and
yeah,
you're
yeah.
doing this work. What's some of the most, on the other side of the spectrum, what's some of the oddest things you've seen as the cause of death?
Just a second. Just before saying that, I'll
Okay.
say something about what you said about these causes of death. Another misconception is kind of like, I'm going to be well trained and I'm going to be a commando, and nobody's going to be able to shoot me because I'm going to be hiding properly. Look, the reality is you're sitting in a hole with artillery falling on you. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter how well trained you are. If you don't have luck, a shell will fall in your hole and you'll be killed, and that's it. And there's nothing you can do about it. The training part is that you're actually in a hole and not just sitting on the ground.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, people might not realize that a lot of what happens is just luck, basically, luck of the draw. This guy beside you got killed, this guy didn't. What was the difference? Nothing. You're just
Right.
standing there and whatever. So what was your question? What's the most strange causes of death, you
Yes.
said?
Yes.
Look, on these bones, I never saw anything particularly strange because it's always either shrapnel or either bullet wounds. So, or else you don't know. You just see the skull is fractured, and without spending an hour or 2 hours cleaning everything and gluing it back together, you can't see what caused the damage.
Yeah.
So I didn't see anything particularly surprising. I did. It's not directly answering your question, but I did interview or did research about a case in southern France on August 15th, where the Germans had captured about 60 French commandos that landed near Cannes, and they sent apparently 4 soldiers with about 30 of those commandos who were unwounded from Cannes to Grasse, the nearby city where the division was located. And local French guys said, let's go and attack those 4 Germans and liberate these commandos. So I think apparently the Germans didn't have any weapons, and the French just had, I think, a couple of pistols. And what the French version was, this guy unfortunately died before I interviewed him, but he was interviewed by a local paper. So it said he grabbed this German, they started fighting, and they fell to the ground. And then he said he picked up a rock and killed the German by bashing his head in. And I thought, I looked through all the lists of killed Germans. I didn't manage to find anybody who matched. And I figured, this must be
Yeah.
another one of these exaggerated stories. I did find a German who maybe matched. His official date of death was August 16th, so it was wrong by one day. And but you couldn't, but I couldn't check this information. The French guy said this story, the German might match, but might not. But now in 2019, they opened the German archives, so you can actually say like, I want to know like such and such a guy, how did he die, what unit was he in, and everything, and you can get that information. So this German I thought might match. I asked for his file. And the French guy said the truth. The cause of death was skull fractures, murder by the partisans or murder by the terrorists. So
Yeah.
that's a very surprising cause of death, I think, for the 20th century war. Having your skull smashed with a stone by somebody else. Yeah, that's a surprising cause of death, and it's confirmed by the German archives themselves.
Wow. And that you did the work to get that. Some of the most incredible stuff is going through primary documents and
Yeah,
sorting
yeah,
through
yeah,
that to find the truth.
yeah. Exactly, exactly,
Very
exactly.
interesting. Very interesting. I would like to ask you, and I mentioned that we were going to get into this. You know, these unsanctioned digging operations that are
Yeah.
happening in Russia. I don't know if they should be called illegal digging operations or if they should be called unsanctioned operations. What is known is that for years, YouTube had been recommending to me these, massive videos put together by Russian named YouTube accounts of groups of mostly young people, my age, I would say, like wading through swamps, finding stuff. Oh, here's a live bomb. All right, we'll chuck that. Here's a helmet. And then what they do with it is not very certain, but how they're treating the remains that they do find versus how they're treating the artifacts. The artifacts are always the YouTube thumbnail. That's what people are clicking on, the artifacts. And so those are the focus of the videos. So you can deduce that's the focus of what they're doing. It's not person centered. They're not trying to identify these bodies. They're trying to get stuff. What's the real situation in Russia regarding that kind of thing?
Well, I'd say when the communism ended, people started digging this stuff up, and I think it was most of them really just purely for money. And the ones I saw in Stalingrad in 2001, I mean, they weren't rich people, they weren't intellectual people, they were just people like instead of being a garbage man, you're one of the guys who digs up German helmets,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't rich by any means. They were just people who were trying to earn a living any way they could, and they happened to end up doing this digging stuff.
Yeah.
Now, since and at the time, if they found Germans or even Russians, I think they just wouldn't do anything. They just take all the stuff and just leave the bones on the ground and wouldn't care about it.
Yeah.
Now I think it's evolved. I think even these guys, even if they're doing it, I won't say illegal, but unsanctionedly or something. Now when they find bodies, even if they're going to take the stuff, even the dog tag, they'll still bring the bones to the Germans with a picture of the dog tag and say, here we found this guy such and such a place. So it seems to have calmed down a bit. I think the Germans might also have understood that if they want to be able to find these bodies, they kind of have to cooperate with these people and not be on their high horses and say like, oh, you dug this body up illegally, so you're not allowed. If you say that, the guy's just he's just never going to collaborate with you again, and you'll just find the bodies spread in the field, So there has to be a bit of collaboration, even though of course it's not archaeological at all. It's not,
of course,
as good as it should be. It's maybe not good at all, but at least now they do bring the bodies to the cemeteries most of the time, as far as I know.
Yeah, it's pretty wild the amount of just kind of content that's out there on the internet of, how do I put this, unofficial archaeology in the East. Why I was so attracted to what you do, because here is a guy taking the time and you're actually caring about what you're finding. You're holding up to the camera, this is how this individual passed away. Here's this ersatz wire joining of this bone showing how it was fixed, during the war. Very person-centered. And I think that's one of the reasons I reached out to you, because it was like, oh, wow, here's some content. Here's somebody actually doing this in a way which I more or less morally agree with.
Yeah.
I am fascinated. And I also just want to say this. The guys, you say these guys who are digging up these German helmets are not rich by any means. I see helmets get sold for crazy amounts of money once they reach the West.
Let me add on to that. So
sure.
This one I said was in 2001. Now you have lots of Russian collectors, so guys who dig, who have a lot of money, and who also are very interested in the history, and who, if they find a helmet with a name, they're going to keep it, and they're also going to try to research the guy. So you do have people like that, like local people who do things seriously. And I mentioned to you that I went there in 2005 with a guy called Eugene Asafov, who was digging in the swamps with his 4 or 5 guy team. And so he was the team leader. He was the guy, you know, selling this stuff over the internet to the States. And he was pretty rich for the time because, you know, already back then it was a helmet for $300 or $400, depending, you know, or if it's camouflaged, 1,000 or whatever.
Oh yeah.
But the guys who were digging for him, they were just the village guys, and he would give them, you know, it was a lot of money for the village, $10, you know, but he was the businessman and they were just the diggers, basically.
What a, geez. What a hell of a way to make a living. You know, I think it's incredible that you grew up where you did, or at least, you know, after you moved to the south of France, you grew up on a battlefield in a place that had seen war. The United States is so insulated. It's so insulated from combat history. I mean, on the East Coast, we have Civil War battlefields, but those, you know, those are pretty much it. And then, you know, you get out more west, you have Indian wars and very small scale documented historical sites. But the United States is just so insulated from the reality of battlefield history. I think that might have a reason why a lot of Americans have really simplistic views of military history. But anyways, the fact that these Russians are like, well, I need to go make my $10. Let's go dig up bodies. They're on a whole nother level. And that's because the Eastern Front was on a whole nother level. And of course, the economic system in Russia is different. And, you know, this is how people need to make money to feed themselves. That's incredible.
It's one way of doing it. Huh. Now it became difficult because now this digging has been going on for so long that it's become really hard to find German things, German bodies. All the good places have been dug up. Of course, they're going to be finding things for years to come, but to find stuff, you have to really know where to dig and have proper equipment and have a good detector, because the place has been detected 50 times already. So now you have to come with a better detector to find something deeper. So yeah.
Okay. Question for you. How have you been able to learn, or excuse me, let me rephrase. What have you learned about graves process, the process of burying soldiers who died in combat from your archaeological expeditions, as I will call them? What have you learned about the process somebody would go through from getting either injured or killed to being buried, or they buried multiple times in multiple places, leading up to after you find them, what happens to that body?
Well, I learned quite a lot, not really from digging, but more from going through the archives and reading books about that and speaking to veterans about that and finding out how the dog tags work, the German dog tags and all that. The digging, usually it's just either you're on the battlefield and there's a guy buried in a shell hole or in a foxhole, or else he's buried in a field cemetery, and that's basically it. And of course, I did learn, like what the people told me in Russia is that like in Russia after the war, there'd been millions of killed, and I don't even know if there was a single military cemetery. I guess there must have been near maybe large hospitals and things like that. But you're at a place like Stalingrad where they say 1 million soldiers died, and there's some tiny cemetery with 5,000 bodies. You know, so where are the other 995,000 of them? You know, so what people told me in Russia is that a missing soldier's family received less pension than a dead soldier's family. So basically, there was no interest for the government to make any kind of official graves or cemeteries. And the standard procedure for any Russian killed was just bury them in the nearest hole. So that's what I learned about the Russians. And then about the Germans, I learned that they took extreme care of their war dead. They always made field cemeteries and everything if they could. Stuff was well documented. If you go in the archives, you have the causes of death written and everything. Yeah. But then of course, they also had people who were killed in enemy territory. So who they never managed to bury themselves and who were buried in whatever random circumstances by the enemy. And then when the Russians advanced, they actually destroyed German cemeteries, you know, or destroyed them on purpose. You have cases
the vengeance of their advance was incredible and something people should read about.
I don't even think it was the vengeance of soldiers. It was probably like, if I can't prove this, I haven't researched it. I don't have the documents, but I suspect that orders were given from high up, like, we don't want German cemeteries, So destroy them, remove the crosses, make a football field over the cemetery, and let's forget about this.
Fair. And I want to just admit that I'm still learning about the Eastern Front. I know I know that the Russians were fed innumerable amounts of propaganda that would stir their hatred of the Germans, the fascist beast. And I know that by the time I've done a bit of reading about Berlin and the culmination of the Russian war in the East in Berlin, and that's some of the most fascinating apocalyptic things I've ever come into contact with, and maybe that's why I've read about it as much as I have. I just know that there wasn't any love lost between Russians, and not necessarily the frontline Russian soldiers. It seems a lot of the guys who are on the front line were aware more of the reality of the people they were facing. Most of the rape, most of the destruction occurred when the second line, the rear echelon guys moved through. That's been documented in what happened in Berlin. And it seems the tankers, apparently the Russian tankers, would take a specific interest in exacting the revenge they've been told they had earned on the civilian populace and among captured folks. Either way, what you do on the ground is just another way to get in touch with that history.
Yeah, being on in an actual fighting area and seeing just the terrain, what it's like, imagining what it must be like to sleep here when it's raining or spend a month there. It's that makes you change perspective, and also finding all these shell fragments and finding damaged things, and it makes you realize the violence of the situation, the complexity of the situation.
Yes, my thought process changed substantially after I had traveled and I'd been reading and sitting very deeply with photography that does exist of the area around Ypres in Flanders. And I went and I stayed for a week and a half right on the battlefield in an Airbnb. And I didn't rent a car. I just walked the whole area. It's not very big. Of course, there's places I missed, and now I think I got to go back. But I'll never forget going to Polygon Wood, which had been fought, and it had changed hands multiple times. It had been on the front line for years. And now there's relatively young trees that cover this place, but now it's a forest again, but you can still see things. It's still, the scars are still on the land. And I'm walking in Polygon Wood, and I found an empty shrapnel shell, maybe 88 millimeters, something around there. It's rusted, so you can't take a caliper to it and find out. But it was empty. I could see that before I touched it. So I picked it up and I thought, oh, there's a museum right by my Airbnb. I'm going to bring this to this museum, and they're going to find this priceless shell, and they're going to care so much about it. I went to the museum and I could see through the fence. There was like the indoor museum and there's the outdoor.
There's a million shells like that piled up in front of it, right?
I couldn't believe it. It was as tall as me and 20 feet long, and they all looked just like that shell. So I put that in my bag and I took it home, and it's like the coolest thing. It's like a real thing that was there, because so much of the stuff that you find here in the States really didn't leave the country, in terms of militaria, because it's like cotton and canvas. It's going to shred. And then when the collectors do find something that may have actually been somewhere, they say, oh, this is in bad condition. It's not worth anything. You know what I mean? So, but anyways, that shell going, and I also found, 303 British shell casings just in a plowed field. It was just wild how this stuff was there, because I had grown up in Oregon in the United States, which is just so insulated from the realities of these battlefields. Well, I had something else I wanted to ask you about before we left. Speaking of shells, live munitions. How often do you come into contact with live munitions on these expeditions?
Well, you come into contact a lot, and you can't really avoid it. People often ask me that question. See, I always ask when I hear, somebody blew up digging. I always ask, what actually happened?
Yes.
And I've never heard a single case where somebody actually blew up digging.
Mhm.
What happens is that they dig, they find something in good condition, a grenade or something, and they decide we're going to empty this.
Oh
And
God, they mess
that's
with it. Yeah, they tink
and
with it.
that's yeah, and when stuff happens. So
Yeah.
basically, my opinion is don't mess with that stuff. It's not worth it. Like if you find a shell, if you're digging, you're gonna have to pick it up and put it on this corner of the field, but don't do anything else with it, and
Yes.
don't act like an idiot with it,
Yes.
obviously.
When I was
Now,
in Belgium, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I
Sorry.
don't think it's 100% safe. Maybe one day, you'll stick your shovel in the ground at exactly the wrong angle. It'll just happen to hit the front of a shell and whatever. But I've never heard of that happening, anyways. I've heard about that happening with machines.
Mm,
In Germany, I heard that a guy was digging with on a construction site and he hit
yeah.
a bomb and it blew up. But you can understand a machine is much more powerful
Yes.
than a human with his shovel.
Yes.
But the people when I go to Stalingrad in the summer, you asked who these Russians are. But what you have to understand now, I didn't mention this, is that in Russia, the way it happens now is that there's literally like a popular movement every summer of thousands of people who aren't military collectors, who aren't battlefield diggers, who come to the battlefields and who look for these bodies.
Mm,
So they're very let's say purist, and they don't really care about the items they find, and their goal is to find bodies and they dig them up really carefully, and that's what you see in my Russian videos when you see all these young girls digging up the bodies and stuff.
yeah.
Those are people who they just do it for 1 or 2 summers and that's it. So, but they do it interestingly better than some professionals from other countries do it. And what I want to say is that, yeah, this summer I wasn't there because of Corona, but 2 people actually got killed with a shell they dug up.
Oh
So I
no.
did ask what happened, and apparently they were trying to dismantle it. Actually, the guys sent me a picture of it, and you could see that it exploded over a piece of cement.
Yeah.
So obviously they must have gone there and put the shell in the cement and then used the piece of cement as a table to try to do something.
Oh
So
no.
2 guys got killed. Yeah, one young guy,
Oh
kid
my
actually.
God. I mean,
So
uh, I had a friend here in Oregon who is like, oh, look at this really cool. Look how nice condition this World War II Japanese grenade is. Look at how
uh-huh.
nice this is. And he hands it to me. I think I'm looking at it. I said, I'm not going to say his name. Hey, John, this fuse has been untouched. It has the original baling wire around it when it was transported. Oh, really? Yeah. See how complete it is. It's a great item. John, this may be live. You understand that, right? Huh. I hadn't thought about that. I was so excited to collect it. Oh God. And then I had heard that my Belgian friends I'd stayed with in Belgium, they said, be careful of the munitions. Somebody just got blown up last year. He was trying to cut one open with a saw. It's like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that.
I saw a guy doing that in Russia. I didn't put it in my videos because I don't want to put stuff that's too stupid or too
Yes.
like it'll make people look like too much fools. But one guy they found a grenade in great condition, and he was sawing it open, and I was standing 30 meters away and filming with the zoom.
Did anything happen?
No, nothing happened. No.
Okay, good. Oh, geez. Oh my God. So you've written some books.
I wrote one book, yeah.
Okay, you've written a book. We're coming to kind of a natural conclusion of our interview here, but I want to make sure that if people want to support you and find your book, they can do so. Tell us about your book. Tell us about, what brought about its writing, what it's about, and how people can find it.
So I mentioned before finding this mass grave of German soldiers in my village. And so this village is called Villeneuve-Loubet, it's near Nice. And I wanted to find out, how did these soldiers die? Who were they and whatever? So I started being really interested in the history of my village. And the unit that had liberated the village was the 1st Special Service Force, which is quite famous. And then I just started getting interested in the other villages right beside mine. And then it turned into being interested in the whole campaign of the 1st Airborne Task Force in southern France. So the 509th, the 517th, from the landing zones till the Italian border. And my work method was, if something happened, if they say that, I don't know, there was some small encounter and 1 or 2 people were killed, find witnesses who know what happened, like Americans, find out the names of the killed, Americans, Germans, French, whatever, find the local French people, find out where the bodies were buried, search the area where the bodies were buried, see if anything is left over, and basically try to rebuild the entire event from all the sources possible. So the end result is my book. So where you have it describes the events day by day, and it's mostly oral history. So I say, like,
Yes.
I company of the 517th attacked Saint-Césaire on the 22nd of August, and then you have a guy who describes his account, how he
Yes.
climbed up the hill, how he was wounded, and then another guy, and then another guy, and then another guy, and then the local French guy explaining, and then pictures of the guys who were killed, pictures of the Germans who were killed, letters that the families received. So basically rebuilding the whole event.
Yeah.
And apparently people like it. It has 5 stars on Amazon and had no bad reviews. And I can understand, because you can literally just open it at any page.
Yeah.
And you'll have some guy explaining one of the most probably traumatizing events of his life, or most exciting moments of his life. So of course it's interesting to read, that kind of story.
Absolutely. Best place for people to find that is on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. It's also on other websites. I'm not sure how many are left now, but you can still buy it on Amazon. I made a French version, and it's been sold out for a couple of years already.
Okay.
Now it's become a collector item in French. They sell it for double the price of.
Just like it makes me think of the Détray books.
Yeah, kind of like
the
that.
south of France. I went to his museum at Dead Man Square, and that's just that's a whole nother podcast. Is the Détray collection and the books he's done, and maybe we'll get a hold of him one day. But you also have a blog and a YouTube channel. What are those called, so that the people can find them?
So the blogs, I'm going to be honest with you. The blogs aren't really blogs. I call them propaganda sites, which is just locations where I briefly describe what I do for digging, for collecting, for whatever, with a few pictures and keywords and articles, but I never update them. It's just so if somebody wants to know what I do, he can read this information and know what I do and contact me.
Yes.
And when it comes to information about southern France, I have the names of all the soldiers I'm interested in on those blogs. So that if a family member says, "Oh, I wonder what granddad did during the war," and looks for his name, he'll find my blog. He'll see that it says, "If you're a relative of this soldier, please contact me," and then he'll contact me. So that's the point. Cool. My real blog is my YouTube channel, where I whenever I see something interesting, I film it and try to make a video that's interesting for random people to see who don't know me and who whatever. And apparently it's been working pretty well, because I have lots of views and lots of people who register and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's how I found you. I'm a voracious YouTube consumer, and that's why I decided to put stuff on YouTube. But I want to do it my way, and I want to do it as accurately and as compassionately as possible.
I thought the same thing. I watch things on YouTube, and I thought, now I'm watching something interesting, so I can film it, and I can make a mini documentary. Or, of course, it's not a real documentary, because I just do everything with Windows Movie Maker and don't even know how to add a voice and everything. So, so it's primitive, but it's compensated by the interesting things that I film in most cases, I think.
Well, if you ever need help, let me know. I'm a fan, and I'd be happy to give you a hand. Not that I'm anything great. People can attest to that, because the stuff I make is pretty simplistic. But I really appreciate you spending the time, taking the time from your evening to discuss this stuff. If you ever want to come back, you're absolutely invited. I think there's a million things that we can still talk about. I'm already itching to get into just airborne operations of southern France with you, and you have such a unique way to look at that. So the invitation's open. Again, I'm going to say it. I appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome, and I'll be back here whenever you want. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Everybody, we have featured an incredible guest today who has just such a unique view and vantage perspective on the real events that happened from 1939 to 1945 in distant parts of the world from me. So it's great that we're able to get him on today. He is Jean-Loup Gassend. He was on today on the Modern Military History Podcast. As always, I am Andy, your host and presenter, trying to bring you interesting stuff like we heard today. Take care, and thanks again for coming on.